All right. So in that time, my internet went out, my camera stopped working, my computer stopped working. Getting through this thing today. All right, so what we're talking about is basically like COVID happened in 2020. We have all these questions. You guys asked really good questions. Um, what does theory say? Okay, we can cover that. I can cover that. But what does the data say is a complicated question. And so the best data that I would use is peer-reviewed data. And like I say, this is a very difficult thing to get published. It takes a really long time, especially in economics. I actually have published in interdisciplinary journals. It takes like a month, but in economics, man, it takes a long time. So we don't have a lot of like ideal data. So a lot of what I did in this class is I gave you articles, right? Like news articles and stuff like this, like the McKinsey report. So there's statisticians doing that work, but what we have is something called stylized facts, which is basically like these facts that just keep coming up over and over again. So for example, like the test gap, we keep seeing this data. Kids are falling behind, kids are falling behind, kids are falling behind. But what we don't get from that is we don't get like a careful analysis. And so Joe was asking a good question. Minority students, a lot of them are in urban areas. Urban areas were more likely to be online. Could this be explaining it, right? We don't have the answer to that because we don't have the data yet. We don't have the regressions. So basically what I'm saying is stay tuned. I'm going to show you some of the stuff that's come out, but it's still very new. The other thing I want to mention is I think a lot of times economists cling to theory. So for example, in the development world, trade is good, trade is good, trade is good. Professor Shu, I know a lot of you took his class, we can show that trade is good. We have such good theory showing us that trade is good. But when you look at the data, that's not true all the time. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So I actually think it's not only interesting to look at the data, but it's responsible to look at the data because sometimes our models don't work. All right, so what do we have in terms of the evidence? So the first time I taught this class, really all I had was this article here. And so this is the guy, Raj Chetty, who did Track the Recovery. Let's see if my internet has stopped working again. All right, so basically we had this paper. Now if we look here, you see the words working paper. A working paper means that it's not peer-reviewed and it's not published. Now this has since been published on NBER.org, National Bureau of Economic Research. You might recognize that from the Business Cycle Dating Committee. Pretty good, right? Like if you can get something published in NBER working paper, it's a good working paper, but it's still a working paper. So this is all I had last time I taught the class, which is basically like, late 2020. What did we know? So basically what happened was the worst off from COVID was the low-wage workers in high-income zip codes. So basically the high-income zip codes, people stopped spending because they could, right? Like in low-income zip codes, people still had to buy food, they still had to buy these essentials. High income, or even like middle income, people like me, I was like, hey, I'm not getting my hair cut. So people who worked in firms or industries or services in those zip codes were hurt the most. The other thing they noticed, and this is interesting, state-ordered reopenings of economies had small impacts on spending and employment. So one of the big questions that's going to come from COVID is there a trade-off between health and the economy, right? So intuitively, yeah, if you're shutting down the economy for health reasons, you're going to have economic impacts. Like during the actual recession, it didn't seem to be the case according to this. But again, this is not published. Stimulus payments to low-income households increased consumer spending sharply, but little of this flowed to the businesses that actually needed it. They found that Paycheck Protection Program loans increased employment by only 2%, implying a cost of $377,000 per job saved. And the other thing that really bothered everyone was, remember those $600 unemployment, like additional benefits? My God, my husband was so upset about these. I should just be unemployed and collect this. So we all expected that this would lead to higher unemployment, right? Because why would you look for work if you're getting 600 additional dollars? They found that it didn't. And this is one of those, it's like a lesson in believing the data over what you think. Because some people would say, well, that's not true. That can't be true, right? But it was true in the beginning. So we get this initial data and it's like, interesting. Do I think this is the whole story? No, I don't. So we're starting to get some high quality peer-reviewed studies. And by the way, if you want to look yourself, what you do is you go to Google Scholar, and that's how you find peer-reviewed papers. Sometimes you get a working paper. I'm a little skeptical of this Vox one. But usually you get journal articles, Journal of Economic, I think it's Economics and Statistics. And so, like, you can always ask me, right? You can email me, hey, is this a good paper? Is this a good paper? But, like, okay, we get this. It's a literature review on all this stuff that's been published. There's a reason I didn't assign this to you. It's a literature review of what other people found. But some of that's not in, like, top journals, right? So some of the stuff they're covering is, like, initial things in maybe journals that, like, you know, aren't publishing like super thorough stuff. If you get it published in a journal, I believe the results, but sometimes they have caveats, right? So like if I publish in a journal, a lot of my stuff is correlational. I find women in Ghana who are Pentecostal earn more money. But like I have all these caveats. I'm not proving if you become Pentecostal, you make more money, all this stuff. Basically what I'm saying is I'm interested in what the top journals are going to be publishing because they're going to be publishing the best stuff. So, what have they been publishing? We're just starting to get this stuff. This one I was looking at today. It's a big question. Should we insure workers or jobs during recessions? And so what they looked at was, in the US, we relied a lot on unemployment insurance. And actually, unemployment insurance has a strong theoretical background. Unemployed people have a high marginal propensity to consume. It should have a good multiplier effect. It's targeting people who need it, all this stuff. Europe did something different, and I actually hadn't heard of this. But in Europe, they did short-time work programs to subsidize labor hoarding. Basically, what they said is, hey, you can cut down your employees to fewer hours, and then we'll make up the difference. So it's like two different ways of helping workers. Basically, what they found is that there's room for both. But if we look at the abstract here, short-term work can be effective at reducing socially costly layoffs against large temporary shocks, but it's less effective against more persistent shocks that require reallocation across firms and sectors. So basically, March 2020, we're all panicking, recession hits, that was effective. But once we go into the longer term, it's maybe not as effective. And of course, I haven't read the whole paper, but you're welcome to do that. The other thing, let me show you this one, is, so this is written by Christina and David Romer. David Romer, like, literally wrote my macroeconomics textbook in grad school. So when he writes something, and when Christina writes something, it's like, all right, well, let's take it seriously. And what they basically did is they were looking at fiscal policy through the lens of optimal social insurance. Super technical. I don't claim to understand this. I don't think we need to spend our time with it, on it. But basically what happens is, if we go right here, whether fiscal policy should aim to just to redistribute income or also to stimulate aggregate demand. And basically they find that some, but far from all, of the implications of social insurance framework were followed. They looked at something called hazard pay in addition to unemployment insurance. In the case of hazard pay, we find that the proposal for a national program, there's something called the HEROES Act, was both broader and more generous than a social insurance perspective would call for. It would have been too big, they're saying. We suggest that social insurance perspective on fiscal policy is likely to become increasingly relevant as pandemics and climate-related natural disasters become more common. Basically, they're like using data and new frameworks to look at fiscal policy. So this is the kind of stuff, like if I'm asked, what is the data showing, what should we be looking at? This is a good paper to be reading. Super complicated. Now my favorite paper that I've read, part of recently is, man, this Paycheck Protection Program was not effective. So we saw, we're looking at the Chetty article. Initial estimates say that for every job saved by this thing, it was $377,000 of taxpayer money. What do these people find? They find that it's extremely ineffective. Let's see if I can find the takeaway here. Basically, yeah, for every job saved, it cost taxpayers $169,000 to $258,000. And actually, it was regressive, so it went to like people who didn't need it rather than like small businesses that didn't need it. So going back to like what we're talking about here, I loved the idea of the Paycheck Protection Program. I was like, this seems like a really great idea. I remember saying this. You can't just look at a good idea, though. You can't just look at the theory. You have to look at what happened, right? Did it work? And man, that PPP did not work. So I would encourage you to just, we start getting academic articles, do a Google Scholar search every once in a while. You can always contact me. Let's see what the evidence is starting to show. But basically what happens is whenever there's a crisis, economists study it for years. So when I was in my PhD program from 2005 to 2009, everyone was talking about the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Then scholars look at the financial crisis. My colleague, Professor Beck, looked at the financial crisis in one of her papers. Now we're going to be looking at COVID. So we're going to see economists studying this. We're going to start to get some answers. But some of your questions that I think have yet to be answered are, which of the Fed tools were successful or not successful? I don't know the answer to that, and I'm looking forward to finding that out. Are we comfortable with a Fed that does this? A lot of you posed questions like, this is too much, and I think that's a reasonable conclusion. I do trust our Fed. I think it's harmful if we don't trust our Fed. But I would hope that the Fed would be a little introspective here. Was this necessary? Was this too much? What caused the inflation and what fixed it? I think I know the answer to this, right? There's demand pull inflation from pent-up demand, the third stimulus bill. Dana said the American Recovery Act today. Thank you, Dana. And then, of course, there's cost push inflation from supply chain issues and the war. But what about the Federal Reserve, right? Did that play a role? I think that the stimulus, the fiscal policy part was bigger. And that's just from timing, right? When did the inflation start? When that was being rolled out. The inflation didn't start prior to that when the Fed was being aggressive. But again, I'm interested to know, like, what's the data going to show? Can we sustain this level of intervention at the fiscal level? My God, our government spent over $4 trillion on this. In the financial crisis, it was less than $1 trillion. And this is Biden, right? He was president during the financial crisis, and he said, hey, I didn't think that was enough. We need more now. I think looking back, we're going to have to question what is sustainable, right? And as many of you point out, of course, we're going to have to pay for this. So it's just an interesting question. What are the long-term effects on industries? One of the things that a lot of you have asked is, what about remote work? Theoretically, flexible and remote work is going to decrease the natural rate of unemployment, and it's going to increase potential output. Companies are saying, hey, I got a bigger labor pool to choose from. But then you might say, well, maybe there's going to be some more inflation because we have more competition for workers. So that's an interesting question that I don't know the answer to. I can tell you theoretically, right? Of course, the racial wealth gap and the gender gap, this is something that we'll be watching as well. So just a few notes. I actually put this on the folder that I shared. A lot of you had such good ideas with these inflation lessons. So good. What do? I do something called presentations to the president. I have a little YouTube video that was produced by my university about this. Basically, during the last week of classes, I pretend to be the president. They have to call me Madam President, and they present to me privately, groups of 4 or 5. Madam President, here's how the economy's doing. Here's what we think should be done. It's very popular. 96% of students like it. And I actually just published an article detailing the whole thing. And it's an open access article, so you're welcome to check that out. And then, of course, last but not least, I have actually published a whole case study, what's not technically peer reviewed, but I've published all my materials. I have them all up from the last time I taught the class. So if you ever want to incorporate any of that stuff, you're welcome to find it there. Now, of course,